Welcome to American Legacy Stories, where we journey back to the heart of the 20th century to uncover the extraordinary resilience of the women who shaped our nation's soul. These are the untold histories of quiet courage, of mothers and grandmothers who, against the backdrop of a rapidly changing America, forged legacies of strength and hope that echo through generations. The afternoon sun, thick and golden as honey, dripped through the lace curtains of the modest parlor, pooling on the worn oak floorboards where 6-year-old Lucy sat, her legs tucked under her. Across from her, in a wingback chair whose floral pattern had long surrendered to the gentle friction of time, sat her grandmother, Agnes. The air was still, holding the scent of yesterday's roast chicken, mothballs, and the faint, papery perfume of old books that lined the walls. It was a Sunday in 1958, a day suspended between the morning's sermon and the evening's inevitable slide toward Monday. For most of their small Ohio town, it was a time for naps and quiet digestion, but in this room, a sacred ritual was unfolding. Between them rested a small, mahogany lap desk, its surface a constellation of ink blots and fine scratches, a testament to decades of use. Agnes's fingers, gnarled by arthritis but still surprisingly deft, held a fountain pen, its nib hovering over a sheet of crisp, cream-colored stationery. "Now watch closely, little bird," she murmured, her voice a low, comforting hum. "The ink must flow from the heart through the hand. It is not just about the words, but the care you put into forming them." Lucy watched, mesmerized, as her grandmother's hand moved with a slow, deliberate grace, the pen whispering across the paper, leaving a trail of elegant, looping script. The sharp, slightly metallic smell of the indigo ink filled the space between them, a scent Lucy would forever associate with love and the quiet weight of unspoken things. Her grandmother was not just teaching her cursive. She was passing down a key, a way to bridge distances, to hold onto memories, to give permanence to the fleeting thoughts of a life. In that quiet room, with the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, a question hung unspoken in the air. What stories, what sorrows and triumphs were encoded in the muscle memory of that hand, in the careful, measured dance of ink on paper? Agnes had not always known such quiet Sundays. Her life had begun 30 years earlier, on a struggling dairy farm in the flattest, most unforgiving part of Indiana, a place where the sky was a vast, indifferent canvas, and the horizon was a ruler straight line you could never quite reach. She was born Agnes Miller, a name as sturdy and unadorned as the land itself. Her world was circumscribed by the rhythms of the seasons and the relentless demands of the herd. Mornings began before sunrise with the cold shock of the milking parlor, and evenings ended with the ache of exhaustion deep in her bones. Yet it was not the work that defined her girlhood, but the silence. Her father, a man broken by the Depression, communicated in grunts and weary sighs. Her mother, worn thin by a succession of stillbirths, moved through the house like a ghost, her presence marked only by the scent of bleach and unspoken grief. In that house of muted sorrow, Agnes found her escape in the written word. She devoured the few books they owned, a tattered Bible, an almanac, a copy of Pilgrim's Progress, but her real solace came from the Sears Roebuck catalog. It was more than a book of goods. It was a catalog of possibilities, a glimpse into a world of polished furniture, vibrant dresses, and smiling, carefree faces. She would spend hours poring over the pages, her imagination filling in the stories behind the illustrations. It was there that she cultivated her dreams as fragile and vibrant as the colored inks she coveted in the stationery section. Her only true connection to the world beyond the farm came through letters. Her mother's older sister, Aunt Rose, lived in Cincinnati, a city that, in Agnes's imagination, was a glittering metropolis of electric lights and endless opportunity. Once a month, a letter would arrive from Rose, written on thin, airmail paper in a hurried, forward-slanting hand. Those letters were a lifeline. They spoke of streetcars and department stores, of a job at the Crossley radio factory, of evenings spent listening to live music. Agnes would read them over and over, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar words, the paper becoming soft and worn with handling. It was through these letters that she learned about a different kind of life, a life where a woman could earn her own wage, make her own choices. Tucked away in a small wooden box beneath her bed was her most prized possession, a simple, silver-plated locket. It had been a gift from her mother on her 16th birthday, one of the few gestures of overt affection she had ever received. It was plain and unadorned, but inside, instead of a photograph, Agnes had carefully folded a tiny slip of paper on which she had copied a line from one of her aunt's letters. "The world is wider than the fields you know," that locket became. Her talisman, a tangible reminder of her aspiration. The catalyst for her departure came not as a sudden storm, but as a slow, creeping drought. The summer she turned 18, the rains simply stopped. The corn withered on the stalk, the pasture turned to a brown, cracked-earth wasteland, and the cow's milk ran thin. The silence in the house deepened, now laced with the sharp edge of desperation. One evening, as she sat on the porch swing, watching the heat lightning flicker on the horizon, her father announced, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, that they were selling half the herd. He couldn't afford to feed them. He then turned to Agnes, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "I've found you a position," he said. "With the Henderson family over in the next county, they need a live-in girl. To help with the children." The words landed like stones in the pit of her stomach. The Hendersons were known to be harsh, demanding people. It would be a life of servitude, a different kind of farm, a different kind of silence. That night, with the scent of dust and dying crops thick in the air, she knew she had to leave. She packed a small cardboard suitcase with her few meager belongings, 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, and the wooden box containing her locket. In the dead of night, she crept out of the house, leaving a note on the kitchen table, her newly practiced script filling the page with words of apology and a fierce, unwavering hope. She walked the 5 miles to the bus station, the locket cool against her skin, its silent message a steady pulse against her heart. As she boarded the pre-dawn bus to Cincinnati, the world she was leaving behind was nothing but a dark, silent silhouette against a faintly lightening sky. The city was a bewildering assault on the senses. The bus pulled into a terminal that roared with a cacophony of sounds she had never experienced before. The screech of brakes, the hiss of steam, the disembodied voices of announcers echoing from loudspeakers, the clamor of hundreds of conversations all happening at once. The air was thick with the smells of diesel exhaust, roasted peanuts, and the damp, subterranean scent of the city itself. For a girl whose world had been defined by the lowing of cattle and the rustle of wind in the cornfields, it was both terrifying and exhilarating. She clutched her suitcase, her knuckles white, feeling utterly adrift in the sea of strange, purposeful faces. Her Aunt Rose lived in a part of the city called Over the Rhine, a neighborhood of narrow, brick tenement buildings packed tightly together, their fire escapes zigzagging down the facades like iron skeletons. The streets teemed with life. Women with headscarves haggled with street vendors, children played stickball in the alleyways, and the mournful sound of a distant accordion drifted from an open window. Rose's apartment was on the 4th floor of a walk-up, a cramped, 2-room flat that smelled of cabbage and pipe smoke. Rose herself was a whirlwind of energy, a stark contrast to Agnes's ethereal mother. She was stout and plain-spoken, her hands stained with machine oil from her job at the factory, but her eyes held a spark of unyielding vitality. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she said, enveloping Agnes in a rough, comforting hug. "You're skinnier than a stray dog. Come in, I'll put the kettle on." Life in Cincinnati was a series of jarring adjustments. Rose found her a job at the same Crossley factory where she worked, a vast, cavernous building that thrummed with the constant, deafening rhythm of machinery. Agnes was assigned to the assembly line, her task a mind-numbing, repetitive motion. soldering a single wire to a circuit board as it passed in front of her over and over for 8 hours a day. The wages were meager, just enough to cover her share of the rent and put a little aside, and the work was grueling. Her fingers, once accustomed to the familiar pull of a cow's udder, were now perpetually sore and burned from the soldering iron. The first few weeks were a blur of exhaustion and loneliness. The other women on the line were older, hardened by years of factory work. They spoke in a clipped, slang-filled shorthand she couldn't understand, their conversations punctuated by bursts of raucous laughter. They regarded her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, this quiet farm girl with her wide, startled eyes and her simple, homemade dresses. Her only respite came in the evenings, when she would retreat to the small corner of the living room that served as her bedroom and write. She wrote long, detailed letters to her mother, filling the pages with carefully curated descriptions of the city, the beautiful dresses in the shop windows, the grandeur of the public library, the taste of a hot pretzel from a street cart. She omitted the noise, the grime, the gnawing loneliness, and the constant, wearying ache in her back and shoulders. She sealed these letters with a sense of duty, a way of reassuring her parents and perhaps herself that her gamble had paid off. The act of writing was a way of imposing order on the chaos of her new life, of shaping her reality into a narrative she could control. It was through this ritual of letter writing that the first thread of connection was woven into the fabric of her new life. One of the older women on the assembly line, a sharp-tongued widow named Martha, noticed Agnes writing during their lunch break one day. Martha was the unofficial matriarch of their section of the line, a woman whose gruff exterior concealed a surprisingly keen sense of observation. "Who you writing to, farm girl?" she asked, her voice raspy from years of breathing factory air. "My mother," Agnes replied, her cheeks flushing. Martha grunted. "My boy Frank, he's over in Korea," she said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "Hates it there, says the cold gets right into your bones. I write to him every week, but my hand cramps up something fierce these days." A few days later, Martha approached her again, a hesitant, almost shy look on her face. "My Frank," she began, "he's a good boy, but he's not much of a reader. Your handwriting, it's real pretty, like something you'd see on a wedding invitation." She paused, fumbling in her apron pocket. "I was wondering if I told you what to say, maybe you could write it for me. I'd pay you, of course." And so began a quiet, symbiotic relationship. Twice a week, during their lunch break, Martha would dictate letters to her son, her blunt, heartfelt words flowing through Agnes's graceful script. Agnes refused any payment, but Martha found other ways to repay her. She began saving a seat for Agnes in the crowded break room, sharing her dessert, and fiercely defending her from the teasing of the other women. "Leave her be," she'd snap. "She's got more sense in her little finger than the lot of you put together." Through Martha, the impenetrable wall of the factory floor began to dissolve. Agnes started to learn the stories of the other women, of Maria, who was saving every penny to bring her family over from Italy, of Betty, whose husband had come back from the war a different, quieter man, of the unspoken camaraderie that bound them together, a shared understanding forged in the heat and noise of the assembly line. At the same time, another thread was beginning to weave its way into her life, this one in the form of a quiet, unassuming man named Samuel. He was the mailman for their route, a tall, lanky young man with kind eyes and a shy smile. He had returned from the Pacific a few years earlier with a slight limp and a reluctance to talk about his experiences. Agnes saw him every morning as she left for the factory. Their interactions were brief, a polite exchange of good morning and looks like another hot one. But she noticed the way his eyes would linger on her for a moment longer than necessary, the way his smile seemed reserved just for her. Their courtship, when it began, was as quiet and tentative as they were. It started with a shared glance, then a lingering conversation on the stoop. He learned about her life on the farm, her love of books, her dreams of a life beyond the factory walls. She, in turn, learned about his passion for woodworking, his desire to one day open his own small furniture shop. One sweltering Saturday afternoon, he found her sitting on the front steps reading. "What's that you've got there?" he asked, gesturing to the book. "It's a book of poems," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "By a woman named Edna St. Vincent Millay." He sat down beside her, his leg brushing against hers. "Read one to me," he said softly. And so she did, her voice growing stronger as she read the words aloud. The poem, a fragile, beautiful thing in the grimy city air. Their relationship unfolded slowly, built not on grand gestures, but on small, shared moments. A walk in the park on a Sunday afternoon, a shared bag of popcorn at a movie, the simple comfort of sitting together in companionable silence. He never pressured her, never pushed her to talk about the family she had left behind. He seemed to understand, in an intuitive way, the quiet sorrows she carried. It was Samuel who encouraged her to look for work beyond the factory. "You're too smart for that place, Agnes," he told her one evening. "Your mind is a beautiful thing. It's a waste to spend your days soldering wires." He brought her the newspaper every day, circling the classified ads for secretarial or clerical positions. "Your handwriting," he'd say, "it's a gift." Agnes began a gradual internal transformation, a shedding of the timid farm girl and the emergence of a quiet, self-assured woman. Bolstered by Samuel's faith in her, she enrolled in a night school typing class. The clatter of the typewriters was a different kind of factory noise, one that held the promise of a different future. She practiced for hours, her fingers flying across the keys, the rhythmic tapping a counterpoint to the drone of the machinery that filled her days. The world outside the factory began to open up to her. Martha invited her to a church potluck, where Agnes, shy but determined, found herself in conversations with women who weren't covered in grease and grime. She discovered the simple joy of community, of shared recipes and neighborhood gossip. She learned to navigate the city's bus system, to find the best deals at the market, to feel at home in the bustling, vibrant chaos she had once found so intimidating. Her relationship with Samuel deepened, moving from a tentative friendship to a steady, unwavering love. He was her anchor in this new world, his quiet strength a constant source of comfort. He showed her the beauty of the city she had overlooked. The intricate stonework on the old downtown buildings, the quiet dignity of the art museum, the way the sunset painted the smoggy sky in hues of orange and purple. He never belittled her rural upbringing, instead, he honored it. He loved hearing her stories about the farm, about the names she had given all the cows, about the way she could predict the weather by the feel of the air. With him, she didn't have to pretend to be someone she was. She could be just Agnes. Her small, hard-won victories were punctuated by quiet setbacks. Her first few job interviews were disastrous. She was so nervous she could barely speak, her simple, homemade dress feeling shabby and out of place in the polished downtown offices. The rejection letters were a painful reminder of the gulf that still separated her from the world she aspired to join. There were times when the loneliness and the sheer exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, when the thought of returning to the familiar, if unhappy, silence of the farm was a tempting siren song. During these moments, she would take out her locket. She would hold the cool metal in her hand, feeling its weight, its permanence. The message inside, "The world is wider than the fields you know," was no longer just a hopeful dream. It was a truth she was slowly, painstakingly living into. Her letters home changed. She still shielded her parents from the harshest realities of her life, but she no longer felt the need to invent a life of glamour. Instead, she wrote about her typing class, about the friends she was making, about Samuel. Her script, once merely a beautiful imitation of the penmanship in books, now had a new confidence, a new authority. It was the handwriting of a woman who was finding her own voice. One evening, Samuel came to her with a small, awkwardly wrapped package. Inside was a brand new fountain pen, its black and gold casing gleaming under the dim apartment light. "For all your letters," he said, his cheeks coloring slightly. "A good writer needs a good pen." That night, writing to her mother, Agnes's hand moved with a newfound fluidity. The pen felt like an extension of herself, a tool not just for communication, but for creation. She was no longer just reporting on her life, she was authoring it. The convergence of fates arrived not with a bang, but with the insidious, creeping dread of the Cold War. The year was 1957, and the launch of the Soviet satellite Sputnik had sent a shockwave of anxiety across the nation. The space race was on, and with it came a surge in government contracts for electronics, for the very components that were being assembled at the Crossley factory. The factory, which had been a place of drudgery, suddenly became a vital cog in the machine of national security. Production quotas were increased, and mandatory overtime became the norm. The low hum of the machinery was now overlaid with a new, frantic energy, a nervous tension that crackled in the air. For Agnes, the timing could not have been worse. After months of searching, she had finally been offered a secretarial position at a small insurance company. It was everything she had dreamed of: a clean, quiet office, a regular salary, a chance to use her mind instead of just her hands. She had given her notice at the factory, her last day scheduled for the end of the week. Samuel had proposed, and they were making plans, saving every spare dollar for a down payment on a small house in a quiet, tree-lined suburb. Their future, so long a distant dream, was finally taking shape, a tangible thing they could almost touch. Then, a letter arrived from her Aunt Rose, who had moved to a different city a few years prior. The letter was short, the handwriting shaky. Her mother had fallen ill, a stroke. She was partially paralyzed, unable to speak. Her father, overwhelmed and ill-equipped to be a caregiver, was struggling to manage. The unspoken plea hung between the lines: "Come home." The news struck Agnes with the force of a physical blow. The world she had so carefully constructed, the future she had so meticulously planned, seemed to shatter in an instant. The thought of returning to the farm, to the suffocating silence and the ghosts of her past, was unbearable. It felt like a surrender, a negation of everything she had worked so hard to achieve. Samuel found her that evening, sitting in the dark, the letter clutched in her hand. He didn't say anything, just sat beside her and took her hand, his presence a solid, comforting weight in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. "What do I do, Samuel?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I can't go back, not for good." "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Together." But the crisis was not just personal, it was communal. At the factory, the pressure was mounting. The government contracts came with strict deadlines and even stricter security protocols. The women on the line were pushed to their limits, their exhaustion palpable. One afternoon, a small fire broke out in their section, caused by faulty wiring and an overworked machine. The flames were quickly extinguished, but the incident left everyone on edge. In the aftermath, a new, more insidious fear began to spread: rumors of layoffs. With the new government contracts came new automation, new machines that could do the work of 10 women. The camaraderie of the factory floor began to fray, replaced by a climate of fear and suspicion. Martha, her face etched with worry, confided in Agnes. "They're phasing us out, girl," she said, her voice a low, defeated whisper. "After all these years, what's a woman my age supposed to do?" Agnes was caught in a cross-current of impossible choices. Her duty to her family pulled her back to the farm, to the life she had fled. Her hard-won independence, her future with Samuel, her loyalty to the women who had become her surrogate family, all pulled her in the opposite direction. She felt as though she was being torn in two. The life-altering decision came to her not in a moment of dramatic revelation, but in the quiet stillness of the pre-dawn hours. She lay awake, the sounds of the city a distant murmur, and thought about her mother. She pictured her lying in that silent house, unable to communicate, her world reduced to the four walls of her bedroom. She thought of her mother's hands, once so capable, now still. And then she thought of her own hands, of the skill she had cultivated, the one thing that was uniquely hers. She rose from her bed and went to the small desk where she kept her stationery. By the light of a single lamp, she began to write. She wrote a letter to the insurance company, regretfully declining their offer. She wrote a letter to Samuel, not of goodbye, but of promise, laying out a plan she had just begun to form. And she wrote a letter to her father. In it, she explained that she would be coming home, but not to stay. She would come for a month to help him get things in order, to set up a system for her mother's care. And then she would return to Cincinnati, to her life, to her future. She went to the factory the next day and spoke to the floor manager. She explained her situation and made a proposal. She wouldn't be returning to the line, but she wanted to help. The new automated systems required detailed logs, production reports, meticulous record keeping. The foremen, men who were skilled with machines, were clumsy with paperwork. Agnes offered to create a system to type up the reports, to manage the flow of information. She would work temporarily for the same wages until they found a permanent replacement. The manager, desperate to meet his quotas, agreed. For the next month, Agnes became the unlikely hub of the factory floor. She set up a small, makeshift office in a corner, her typewriter a strange and wonderful new machine in the midst of the old, familiar ones. She translated the foremen's cryptic notes into clear, concise reports. She created schedules and tracking sheets. But more than that, she became the communicator for the women on the line. She helped them write letters of appeal to the union, letters of inquiry about severance pay, letters to their families explaining the uncertain future. She used her gift, the one she had so carefully nurtured, not just for herself, but for her community. Her small desk became an island of order and hope in a sea of anxiety. Martha would stop by every day, bringing her a cup of coffee. "You're doing a good thing, Agnes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've got a good heart." Agnes had found a way to bridge the two worlds that were pulling her apart. She was no longer just the farm girl or the factory worker. She was the writer, the communicator, the one who could give voice to the unspoken fears and hopes of those around her. It was a role she had unknowingly been preparing for her entire life. Agnes did go home. The month on the farm was one of the most difficult of her life. The silence was heavier than she remembered, thick with the weight of her mother's illness and her father's grief. Her mother, lying still and silent in the dim light of the bedroom, would follow Agnes with her eyes, a universe of unspoken thoughts trapped behind them. Agnes read to her for hours, the words of the poems and stories she had come to love filling the quiet room. She set up a routine, hired a local woman to help a few hours a day, and taught her father how to manage her mother's care. But the most important thing she did was write. She created a large journal, and every day she would write a letter to her mother in it, telling her about her day, about the memories she had of growing up on the farm, about her life in Cincinnati, about Samuel. And she would read it aloud to her. On her last day, as she read her final entry, she saw a single tear trace a path down her mother's pale cheek. It was the most profound communication they had ever shared. Returning to Cincinnati was a true homecoming. Samuel was waiting for her at the bus station, his quiet presence a balm to her weary soul. They were married a few months later in a simple ceremony at the local courthouse, with Martha and a few of her friends from the factory as witnesses. They bought their small house, and Samuel, in the evenings and on weekends, began to build furniture for it, his hands, like hers, finding their truest expression in the act of creation. Agnes did not return to the factory. Her work there had earned her a reputation, and she found a permanent position as an administrative assistant at a small manufacturing company, a job where her skills were valued and her intelligence respected. Her success was not measured in wealth or status. It was measured in the quiet rhythms of the life she and Samuel built together. It was in the smell of sawdust from his workshop in the garage, in the taste of the vegetables they grew in their small backyard garden, in the comfort of their shared bed at night. It was in the family they created, first with their son and then with their daughter. It was in the strength of their community, in the lifelong friendships forged on the factory floor and nurtured over years of neighborhood barbecues and shared joys and sorrows. Agnes passed on her legacy not through inheritance but through instruction. She taught her children and later her grandchildren the importance of hard work, of kindness, of finding your own voice. And she taught them how to write letters, how to put care and thought into the words that connect us to one another. Her sacrifices had paved the way for them, creating a world wider and more full of possibility than the fields she had once known. The afternoon sun, thick and golden, dripped through the lace curtains of the parlor. Agnes, her hair now a soft, silver halo, looked at her granddaughter, Lucy, whose small hand was struggling to guide the fountain pen across the page. The pen was the same one Samuel had given her all those years ago, its casing now worn smooth with use. Lucy was writing a thank you note to her aunt for a birthday present, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's hard, Grandma," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "The ink goes all over." Agnes reached out and gently guided the small hand, her gnarled fingers covering Lucy's. "Just go slowly," she murmured. "Let the ink flow. It's not just about the words, little bird. It's about the connection." As she looked at the two hands, one young and unlined, the other a roadmap of a long and well-lived life, both holding the same pen, she felt a profound sense of peace. The locket, which she still wore every day, rested against her skin, its message no longer a distant aspiration, but a lived reality. The world was indeed wider than the field she had known, and she had filled that world with love, with family, with a quiet, unyielding grace. The legacy was not in the letters themselves, but in the act of writing them, in the love that flowed from the heart, through the hand, a steady, unbroken line connecting one generation to the next, a testament to a life not of grand achieve, immense but of small, beautiful, and hard-won hope.